Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject both scandalous and scholarly. The intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era of chivalry and deeply suspicious herbal remedies. A time when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one's watching. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets in candlelit chambers, while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family, including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered, so did volume. And ideally, so did whether the kids were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury, beds were shared, and even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the bed, or standing in the corner pretending not to notice anything. Many noble households kept records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Travelling also didn't help. Inns often had shared beds. That's right, total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. Want a little affection? You better check if there's already someone in the bed, and whether or not they brought their boots. If you were married, and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best. If you weren't married, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip travelled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief. Just reproduction. Everything else? Distracting at best, sinful at worst. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't acceptable, in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and, in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent? Also no. That left maybe Tuesdays in April. Even within marriage there were expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but not excessive. Displays of passion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. One 13th century guide suggested that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is, by all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was missionary, and not just for religious symbolism. It was deemed the most natural, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else was considered suspect. That includes things like enthusiasm. Confession also got involved. Priests often asked pointed questions during confession to determine whether couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These weren't vague spiritual inquiries, they were very specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let's just say the average 14th century friar knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests ignored these rules entirely, and many lay people, particularly peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of St. Valentine himself, who, ironically, was never married. The Church had opinions, and by opinions we mean strict prohibitions, on when intimacy was allowed. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays? Still no. Day of penance. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Add in Lent? 40 days. Advent? Another 40. Various saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain moon phases, and you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven, even when the body had other ideas. There were even lists, actual lists, of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which translated to more than once a month. He recommended they direct their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, weather, and not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of St. No Fun. To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children, divine punishment, or, worst of all, a reputation. If your neighbours caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to shame, gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, poetry, and whispered confessions, you'd be better off reading a troubadour ballad. Real-life courtship for most people involved livestock, land rights, and two families agreeing not to start a feud. Marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between neighbours who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise not to be entirely insufferable. Courtship, when it happened, was supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely courted alone. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess moves, and affection was something you developed later, or not at all. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. Romantic. Even among peasants, practical concerns ruled. A man's suitability was judged by his land, tools, or the size of his ox. And women? They were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, reputation, and general ability to not start drama at the market. This doesn't mean love didn't exist, it did, but it usually came after marriage, not before. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Think of it like medieval emotional DLC, not included in the base marriage package. Still, where there's a will, there's a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just be careful. Get caught kissing behind the barn, and you could face public penance, a fine, or a very disappointed father with a pitchfork. Let's clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except, not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailors advertised them. No laws regulated them. No churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing. Which makes sense, because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual, and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative. And nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noblewomen were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators. And any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations, lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field." In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centres, brothels operated as legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts, long before the light bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colourfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins, like adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled. Officially, it condemned the entire practice. But unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've grasped the essence of medieval theology in practice. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities, where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks. Yes, actual handbooks, for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied, services were catalogued, and in some cases, customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval tinder, it was not. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering, a soft breeze through the thatched roof. Your beloved whispers sweet nothings, and then removes their wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list, just somewhere after surviving the plague, fixing the roof, and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, maybe once a month, more if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, expensive, and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal, or both. If you were wealthy, you had options. A hot bath could be drawn, scented with herbs, and followed by being rubbed with linen cloths by attendants. If you were poor, your sponge bath involved a cold bucket and the vague hope that nobody would notice your aroma over the stables. To add complexity, water itself was occasionally viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Some believed bathing too frequently could weaken the body or open the skin to illness. Others simply didn't have the time, or the tub, or any water that wasn't already being fought over by the local geese. Now, imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume? Mostly for the elite. Deodorant? A dream of the distant future. Dental care? Well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure. Clothing didn't help. Layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every scent you encountered during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet, people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps our standards were different. Or perhaps, when everyone smelled equally awful, love was truly blind. And nose blind. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviours led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burned some calories. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax. And there are scattered references to, let's call them medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labelled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly, denounced loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. And when it failed, which it often did, well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. Despite what church authorities liked to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cosy. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was, well, common enough to require a lot of paperwork. Known as fornication in church records and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip, intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but it was definitely monitored. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls, which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught, or even suspected, of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and occasionally to someone who claimed to have witnessed the event. Medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on whether it was a first offence, whether a pregnancy resulted, or whether the couple eventually got married. In some cases, getting married after the fact erased the fine, kind of like retroactive permission. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Early bird penalties, if you will, and let's not forget the social consequences. In tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So even if your local priest was feeling merciful, your neighbours weren't. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in July. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in something called hand fasting, a sort of informal engagement where the couple considered themselves betrothed, and in some regions that was legally enough to begin cohabiting. The church later tried to tighten that loophole, but in the meantime, a lot of medieval babies were technically early arrivals. Among peasants, this was all handled with a bit more practicality. If a couple was clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or firm push from both families. Among nobles, however, consequences could be far worse, especially if inheritance or reputation was on the line. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. But if she didn't, well, some eyebrows would rise, and a small fine or shotgun wedding might sort things out. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. Noble women's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honour. A broken engagement might spark a feud. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of planning. So how did they verify it? Well, badly. Sometimes it came down to vague testimony and character references. She seemed virtuous, or she avoided the stable boy mostly. Other times, more invasive methods were used, like midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen, which science has since confirmed is not, in fact, a medieval chastity barometer. But that didn't stop anyone. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding, such as displaying a blood-stained sheet, like a very awkward medieval Yelp review. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions, and if the sheet stayed clean, cue lawsuits, annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling a royal soap opera. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Virginity was also linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is beautiful in theory and incredibly uncomfortable in practice. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest, it didn't just ruin her, it could drag down her entire family's honour and property claims. So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality, it was legal currency. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Human nature didn't start in the 20th century, but if you're wondering whether it was openly accepted, that's where things get complicated. Medieval society was structured around religious doctrine, social roles, and property rights, and all three had a lot to say about who could love whom. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman within marriage, preferably for the purpose of making more villagers. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labelled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts, like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. Punishments varied wildly depending on region, time period, and who was involved. A peasant couple might get a scolding and penance. Nobles, they might face exile, or quietly be ignored if they had enough land. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was messier. We have records, poems, letters, even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and more longing. Noblewomen sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred lines. All male monasteries and all female convents created deep emotional bonds. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between, but either way, there were feelings involved, and possibly poetry. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out, you just lived, carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, saints' stories, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives. Risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride, or property. Let's be clear, adultery wasn't just a personal failing. It was a social offence. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. So when someone strayed, they weren't just breaking hearts. They were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. For women, the stakes were significantly higher. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or, in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life. Think less scarlet letter, more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, got more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but not legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. That said, not all adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments, such as parading through the village in nothing but a shift or having to pay for a new church bell, because nothing says divine justice like bronze acoustics. The real danger, however, wasn't always the law. It was the husband. Honour killings weren't unheard of, particularly among nobles. If a cuckolded man discovered his wife's affair, medieval custom sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, duels, annulments, or decade-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial. A fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip. In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the way we understand it today. It wasn't about mutual respect or enthusiastic yeses. Instead, it was tangled in law codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the occasional shrug from society. Let's start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognise the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That's right. Two people saying "I will" in a field somewhere could technically be married. Romantic? Possibly. Legally confusing? Absolutely. But here's the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory doesn't mean it was respected in practice, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after arrangements were made. Families negotiated marriages like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested, or strongly implied. But in the end, the dowry talked louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were broader, but still pressured. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Saying no to the local Reeves' son? Riskier still. Inside marriage, consent became even murkier. Husbands had legal rights to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers argued that spouses owed each other the marital debt, which sounds like a joint checking account, but was actually far less voluntary. Still, the picture wasn't all grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, especially when witnesses were available or the accused didn't have powerful friends. In urban centres like London or Paris, court records show women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes winning justice, or at least making a public stink. And let's not forget the literary side. Medieval tales are full of complex dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for example, often danced around consent, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone dramatically swooning. If nothing else, they knew it was important to ask, even if they ignored the answer. If you ever felt like the medieval church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you're right. It wasn't just complicated, it was borderline suspicious. And that suspicion extended right into the bedroom of every married couple, where the church preferred, ideally, that nothing too enjoyable was going on. To be fair, the church didn't outright ban marital relations. That would have been a logistical nightmare for inheritance, population, and, well, humanity. But it did strongly recommend moderation. Extreme moderation. Like, once a month, in the dark, no smiling kind of moderation. Theologians of the time praised celibacy as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to live in continence, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older, holier, or simply tired of each other. A couple who voluntarily gave up intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers like St. Jerome went even further. He argued that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. Marital relations were acceptable only for procreation, not for fun, not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly fetching in their woolen nightshirt. This attitude filtered down into confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Picture the awkward silence that must have followed that question at the altar rail. And yet, people still lived their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and even nobles nodded politely at the church's teachings, then went home and did whatever felt right between chores, taxes, and the odd peasant uprising. Let's be honest, after a long day threshing barley or settling land disputes, a little affection probably felt more comforting than shameful. But for the truly devout, celibate marriages were held up as models of spiritual partnership. These were couples who lived together, prayed together, and considered carnal urges a thing of the past, or at least a thing better left to younger, less holy villagers. After everything we've covered, arranged marriages, fines for flirting, herbal birth control, suspicious bath habits, and church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is yes. Awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and marketplaces, trading favours, flowers, and whispered gossip over turnips. Noble lovers exchanged poetry and secret glances during formal banquets, while pretending to care about hunting falcon breeds. Monks and nuns wrote letters filled with emotion that modern readers still debate. Was it spiritual longing, or something more? Literature from the period is bursting with romance. Troubadours sang of distant ladies who inspired knights to go off and get very dramatically injured. Stories of courtly love glorified longing from afar, especially if you were pining for someone married to your boss. Sure, the love was often unattainable, But hey, that's where the best verses come from. In some cases, couples genuinely married for love. Records survive of peasants who eloped or refused matches arranged by their parents. Even nobles occasionally rebelled, much to the horror of their family accountants. The church, interestingly enough, actually required verbal consent from both bride and groom, even if that consent was delivered through gritted teeth while holding a goose as dowry collateral. And once married, many couples built strong partnerships. They worked side by side, raised children, endured plagues, and navigated taxes, which is basically the medieval version of a romantic getaway. Letters between spouses, especially during times of separation, show real affection, real longing, real commitment. Even widows and widowers sometimes remarried for companionship rather than political gain, choosing someone they like to spend their remaining years with. Because even after everything, the rules, the risk, the ritual, people still wanted to feel loved, preferably before curfew, and hopefully not during Lent. It all began with a disaster. Zeno of Citium, a wealthy merchant from the island of Cyprus, had it all. Ships loaded with precious dyes, trade routes mapped across the Mediterranean, and the kind of fortune that made a man feel invincible. But fate, as ancient philosophers love to remind us, doesn't care how many ships you own. Somewhere near Athens, Zeno's fleet was caught in a violent storm. The sea didn't just swallow his cargo, it swallowed his identity. One moment, he was a merchant. The next, a man with nothing. When he finally reached the Athenian shore, he was broke, soaked, and, ironically, on the verge of something far more enduring than trade wealth. With nowhere to go, and nothing left to lose, Zeno wandered into a small bookshop in the Athenian Agora. It was here that he picked up a worn copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a text that preserved the wisdom of Socrates. Intrigued by the quiet power of the ideas within, Zeno asked the bookseller where he could find a man like Socrates. The bookseller simply pointed to a stooped, cranky philosopher named Crates walking by. And so, Zeno began studying under Crates the Cynic, a man known for rejecting wealth and possessions with almost theatrical dedication. He once threw his money into the sea just to prove a point. At first, Zeno struggled with this extreme lifestyle. He wasn't ready to live in poverty for philosophy's sake. But Crates planted a seed in his mind, one that grew into a new way of thinking. Zeno didn't stay a student forever. Over time, he pieced together his own worldview, borrowing Socratic ethics, Cynic discipline, and the logical rigour of earlier thinkers like Heraclitus. Eventually, he began teaching in the painted colonnade of Athens, the Stoa Poikile, a public porch decorated with murals. That's where Stoicism got its name, not from an ivory tower or secret academy, but from a painted porch open to all. It's a fitting origin, a philosophy born not from luxury, but from ruin. Not in a palace, but in a moment of humility. Stoicism, from its first breath, was designed to help people navigate the wreckage, not avoid it. And Zeno was its first survivor. After the shipwreck and the scrolls, after the quiet conversations with cynics and the long walks under the Athenian sun, Zeno didn't just start teaching, he started redefining what it meant to live well. At the heart of his philosophy was one powerful idea: logos. To the Stoics, logos wasn't just reason. It was the divine, rational structure of the universe, the cosmic blueprint. Everything, they believed, happened for a reason, whether or not humans could understand it. The world, messy as it seemed, was ordered, and if you could align your thinking with that cosmic order, you could live with peace, clarity, and moral strength. Zeno and his early followers taught that virtue, arete in Greek, was the only true good. Not fame, not wealth, not even physical health. Those were indifferents, things that might be nice to have but didn't define your moral worth. What mattered was how you handled them. And that's where the Stoic mindset takes shape. The world throws chaos at you, but you remain unmoved. Not emotionless, but anchored. You can't control external events. You can't control what people say or do. But you can always control your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. It was radical. Most people back then, and let's be honest, most people today, chase comfort, admiration, money, or control. But Stoicism offered a quieter path. Live in harmony with nature, accept fate without resentment, and strive only to be good, not to feel good. Their favourite analogy? Life is like being a dog tied to a cart. You can either run with it or be dragged behind. Either way, the cart's going forward. Your choice is how you move with it. Zeno wasn't alone for long. His students began gathering in the Stoa, discussing how to master themselves rather than the world. Over time, this porch talk turned into one of the most quietly resilient philosophies in history, and one that would outlast empires. But philosophy doesn't live in theory, it lives in practice. And in the next generation, a new Stoic would take the reins. One who fought battles not with logic alone, but with discipline and steel. His name? Cleanthes, a former boxer who brought muscle to the mind. Cleanthes wasn't your typical philosopher. Before he ever scribbled a single scroll or stood beneath the painted porch, he was a boxer. Not metaphorically, a literal pugilist, earning his bread through sheer physical strength and relentless endurance. But when he discovered Zeno's teachings, he found a different kind of strength, the kind that didn't bruise but braced the soul. He worked by night carrying water for a gardener and studied philosophy by day. His hands were calloused, his muscles worn, but his mind unshakable. Cleanthes embodied the Stoic belief that virtue comes not from privilege, but from perseverance. He didn't speak of theories he hadn't tested. If Zeno taught that one should accept hardship with grace, Cleanthes lived it every sunrise. His most famous work, the Hymn to Zeus, is a poetic tribute to Logos, the divine rationality that governs all things. But don't let the title fool you. This wasn't religious flattery, it was a calm declaration of cosmic order. Everything, Cleanthes wrote, is woven into a grand plan, even the painful parts. His Stoicism was like a glacier, silent, immense, and impossible to move. He also introduced a more emotional texture to Stoicism. While Zeno emphasized logic and detachment, Cleanthes suggested that proper emotions, like awe at nature or love for wisdom, could have a place if they aligned with reason. He wasn't arguing for indulgence, just for balance. After all, what good is a philosophy that turns you into a robot? Cleanthes wasn't flashy, and he didn't gather crowds with clever wordplay. In fact, some mocked him for being slow of speech. But what he lacked in eloquence, he made up for in steadiness. And in Stoicism, steadiness was everything. He eventually succeeded Zeno as head of the Stoic school, not because he was charismatic, but because he lived the philosophy more fully than anyone else. His life was a kind of walking proof, a quiet testament that one could endure hardship without bitterness, question fate without rage, and remain grounded without giving up on greatness. Through Cleanthes, Stoicism gained muscle. Not the kind that wins applause, but the kind that holds your spine straight when the world goes sideways. And then came a man who sharpened Stoicism like a blade, Chrysippus, the logician who turned this porch-born philosophy into a towering system of thought. If Zeno founded Stoicism and Cleanthes gave it strength, Chrysippus gave it its skeleton. Without him, Stoicism might have crumbled into vague ideas and forgotten porch lectures. Instead, it became one of the most rigorous philosophical systems in the ancient world, thanks to a man who reportedly wrote over 700 books. Most of them now lost, but their influence? Undeniable. Chrysippus was relentless. He didn't just inherit the school from Cleanthes, he rebuilt it. Where Zeno had been reserved and Cleanthes poetic, Chrysippus was surgical. His specialty: logic. In a time when most philosophers leaned on rhetoric or emotional appeal, Chrysippus built a system of reasoning that could rival Aristotle's. He was obsessed with clarity. He believed that if Stoicism was to survive, it couldn't rely on charisma or tradition. It had to make sense. Ironclad. No loopholes. No fluff. He refined the Stoic distinction between what is in our control and what is not. He expanded their ethics, metaphysics, and physics into something coherent and unapologetically difficult. Chrysippus argued that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, not virtue plus comfort or virtue plus friends. Just virtue, full stop. One of his most famous contributions was the lecton, a concept describing the meaning behind words. He argued that every spoken word had a sayable, a layer of content carried by speech, tied to logic. It might sound abstract, but this deepened the Stoic understanding of reason and clarity, which for them was essential to a good life. But he wasn't just dry parchment and dusty scrolls. Chrysippus had a biting wit. Once, when accused of not practicing what he preached, he supposedly replied, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick? He still knows how to treat illness." Stoicism wasn't about pretending to be perfect. It was about trying, every single day, to close the gap between your actions and your ideals. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism hardened. It became more than a comfort for shipwrecked merchants or poetic boxers. It became a discipline, something you studied, practiced, and used to cut through confusion and chaos. And that discipline would soon find its way out of Greece, into the heart of Rome, where emperors and slaves alike would grapple with its power. By the time Stoicism drifted into Rome, the philosophy had already weathered centuries of refinement. But in the hands of the Romans, it evolved from a Greek intellectual pursuit into a way of life suited for statesmen, generals, and even emperors. The Romans weren't interested in abstract metaphysics or syllogisms about lector. They wanted practicality. They faced wars, conspiracies, betrayal, and personal ruin, and they needed a system that could hold their inner world steady, while the outer world collapsed. Stoicism, with its focus on self-mastery and virtue in the face of chaos, was a perfect fit. Enter Seneca the Younger, philosopher, playwright, and reluctant advisor to the notoriously unstable Emperor Nero. Seneca wasn't born into hardship. He was a wealthy elite, well-educated, and dangerously close to power. But despite his position, his writings reveal a man deeply aware of life's fragility and the corrupting lure of comfort. In his letters to Lucilius, Seneca preached restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warned against being ruled by emotion or desire, and yet his own life was a battlefield between Stoic ideals and political compromise. He amassed wealth even as he wrote about frugality. He served a tyrant even while writing about virtue. But rather than discredit him, this tension makes him more relatable. Seneca didn't pose as a saint. He was painfully aware of his contradictions. His advice to others often came with a quiet self-rebuke. "I am not a wise man," he wrote, "but a lover of wisdom." And maybe that's the most Stoic thing of all, not to claim mastery, but to pursue it humbly. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the elite, another Roman gave it to everyone else. Epictetus, a former slave. Crippled and impoverished, Epictetus owned nothing, not even himself. And yet he taught that true freedom comes from within. "You may chain my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." To him, life's hardships weren't obstacles. They were training grounds for virtue. His teachings, preserved by his student Arrian, became a Stoic manual for inner liberation. In Rome, Stoicism was no longer just philosophy. It was armour, mental armour. And soon, that armour would be worn by the man who ruled the known world, Marcus Aurelius, emperor, warrior, and the most unlikely of all, a philosopher king. It's one thing to read philosophy in peace. It's another to write it on the front lines of war, while ruling an empire crumbling at its edges. Marcus Aurelius, crowned emperor of Rome in 161 CE, was a man born into unimaginable privilege. And yet, His reign was anything but comfortable. Plague swept across the empire. Germanic tribes pushed at the borders. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died early. His generals betrayed him. And worst of all, his own son, Commodus, would grow into the tyrant he had hoped never to raise. Amid all this, Marcus didn't write speeches or propaganda. He wrote to himself, quiet, personal reflections later compiled into the Meditations. Never intended for publication, these pages offer a window into a Stoic mind under siege. They read not like declarations from a throne, but like whispered reminders from a tired man trying to stay upright. Begin each day by telling yourself, he wrote, "Today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." That wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. Marcus believed that by expecting hardship, he could face it without being thrown off course. To him, people's actions were not insults, they were reflections of their ignorance. And his duty wasn't to control others, but to control himself. He often reminded himself, "You could die tomorrow. You could die today. So act now, not with anxiety, but with purpose." That wasn't despair, that was clarity. Despite commanding legions and managing a vast empire, Marcus was obsessed with inner life. He believed you could be surrounded by chaos and still remain untouched if your mind stayed anchored in reason and virtue. He rarely indulged in cruelty. He rejected opulence, and while he couldn't always live up to Stoic ideals, who could? He returned to them like a compass in a storm. Marcus Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism, but in many ways he lived it more visibly than anyone before him. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just for philosophers in togas or ascetic monks. It was for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, who wanted to carry peace into the battlefield of life. And yet, after Marcus, the flame of Stoicism began to flicker. It wouldn't vanish, but it would retreat, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by new seekers of calm in the modern world. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, Stoicism didn't exactly die, but it faded. The philosophy that had once stood at the heart of Roman intellectual life began to slip quietly into the background. Part of this had to do with politics. Marcus's son, Commodus, inherited the empire and seemed determined to undo every Stoic virtue his father lived by. While Marcus embodied restraint and wisdom, Commodus embodied indulgence and vanity. The Roman court became a theatre of excess, and philosophy had no role in the spectacle. Meanwhile, a new force was rising: Christianity. As it spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became state religion, its theology, rituals, and worldview began to replace the ancient schools. Where Stoicism taught self-reliance, Christianity emphasized divine grace. Where Stoicism taught acceptance of fate, Christianity spoke of redemption and the will of God. Though these ideas weren't always in conflict, Christian thinkers often saw Stoicism as a noble but ultimately pagan system, admirable yet incomplete. And yet, Stoicism didn't vanish. It simply migrated, its core ideas seeping into early Christian thought. Many church fathers admired the Stoics. Thinkers like Augustine, though critical of Stoic pride, respected their moral seriousness. And monastic traditions, especially among Christian ascetics, borrowed heavily from Stoic discipline. Silence, simplicity, denial of luxury, and the examination of conscience, all of these would have felt right at home in the writings of Epictetus or Seneca. Throughout the medieval period, Stoicism became a sort of background philosophy, respected by scholars, cited by monks, but rarely practiced in full. It was no longer a public movement or a street-side school. It was a whisper in the margins, kept alive by scribes, theologians, and the occasional curious mind. But survival is sometimes stronger than success. Stoicism's quiet endurance meant that when the intellectual winds shifted centuries later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, its ideas would be ready to return. For all its decline, Stoicism had left seeds buried in the soil of Western thought. And when people once again sought clarity, purpose, and strength without illusion, those seeds would bloom. And one day, they'd even show up in places no ancient philosopher could have imagined, in self-help books, leadership seminars, and yes, on your favourite podcast. Stoicism's comeback didn't arrive with a scroll in hand. It came through blogs, books, and podcasts. After centuries of quiet influence, the ancient philosophy found itself suddenly reborn in the digital age, repackaged for a world buzzing with distractions, anxieties, and the pressure to constantly optimize everything. In the 20th century, philosophers like Pierre Hadot began peeling back the layers of Stoicism, reminding readers that it wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a way of life. Not cold, but contemplative. Not harsh, but healing. Hadot argued that ancient philosophy was originally a spiritual practice, and Stoicism, more than any other school, was meant to be lived, not merely read. That message hit home for a new generation. In the early 2000s, authors like Ryan Holiday helped usher Stoicism into the mainstream with accessible books like The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy. Drawing on Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, Holiday framed Stoicism as a practical toolkit for resilience, something you could use whether you were launching a startup, coaching a sports team, or just trying to survive a bad Monday. Tech leaders and entrepreneurs soon latched on. Tim Ferriss, Naval Ravikant, and others began citing Stoic texts like instruction manuals for high-performance living. The idea was simple. In a world that moves fast, thinks shallow, and craves constant validation, Stoicism offers an antidote: stillness, control, and clarity. Even mental health professionals took notice. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, borrow heavily from Stoic principles. Challenge your thoughts. Focus on what you can control. Don't let emotion dictate action. Sound familiar? But the revival wasn't without criticism. Some said modern Stoicism had been stripped of its depth, turned into motivational wallpaper for productivity bros. And there's truth to that. Not every inspirational quote on Instagram reflects the rigour or humility of ancient practice. Still, the fact remains. Stoicism survived not because it was trendy, but because it works. When life goes sideways, when we lose a job, face a diagnosis, or wake up unsure of our place in the world, Stoicism reminds us, you can't control what happens, but you can control what you become. That message has never been more timely, and so we arrive at the present, where ancient wisdom quietly guides modern minds. Today, Stoicism exists in a paradox. It is an ancient philosophy designed for inner peace, now living in a world obsessed with noise. Scroll through social media and you'll see a quote from Marcus Aurelius, sandwiched between cat videos and stock tips. Open a bestseller list, and there it is again. The Daily Stoic, waiting to be your morning mental vitamin. Somehow, a 2,300-year-old porch philosophy is trending. But Stoicism isn't popular because it's fashionable. It's popular because it addresses a very specific modern hunger, mental clarity in a world of confusion. When everything feels out of control, the economy, relationships, climate, algorithms, Stoicism offers a map inward. It teaches us to focus, not on the chaos around us, but on the choices we still own. The central questions remain the same. What is in your control? What kind of person will you choose to be, regardless of circumstance? And unlike some philosophies that demand total withdrawal from the world, Stoicism invites us to participate. Go to work, raise your kids, serve your community, but do it from a place of calm, not craving. Action, yes, but grounded action. In that sense, Stoicism is a kind of rebellion, not the loud, sign-waving kind, but a silent resistance against impulsiveness, distraction, and emotional chaos. It's the discipline to pause before reacting, the courage to stay kind in a cruel moment, the humility to know you're not the center of the universe, but you are responsible for how you move through it. More than ever, people are returning to this simple clarity. Athletes use it to manage pressure. Veterans use it to process trauma. CEOs use it to lead without ego. Teenagers, overwhelmed by the constant flood of comparison and digital noise, turn to Epictetus for a lifeline. Of course, no philosophy is a magic cure. You'll still feel grief, still fail, still lose your temper. But Stoicism gives you something rare, a framework to get back up, reflect, and recenter. In the end, it's not about being perfect, it's about progress. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And in a world that rewards loudness, maybe the most revolutionary act is to be still. To a modern visitor, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury resort. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, statues of gods, and pools steaming in the morning sun. But to a Roman, it was just another Tuesday. Bathing wasn't an occasional treat. It was a daily ritual, and for many, an essential part of being Roman. By the height of the empire, there were over 900 public baths in Rome alone, ranging from grand imperial complexes to modest neighbourhood facilities. Everyone from senators to shoemakers made time to bathe. Cleanliness was important, yes, but so was the rhythm of the experience, the routine, the conversation, the heat. The process was deliberate. You'd enter through the apoditerium, or changing room, where slaves might help wealthier patrons undress. From there, you'd ease into the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your pores and began the relaxation. Then came the caldarium, the heart of the experience, a hot, steamy chamber heated by an underfloor system called the hypocaust. Here, bathers would sweat, scrape their skin with strigils, curved metal tools, and sometimes even get a massage. Finally, you'd plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool meant to tighten the skin and jolt the senses. It was this contrast, hot to cold, sweat to chill, that gave the ritual its power. Romans believed it was good for circulation, digestion, and even mood, and honestly, they were probably right. But more than hygiene or health, baths were about belonging. You went to see and be seen. You gossiped, networked, debated politics, made business deals, or just eavesdropped on the latest scandal. Some brought their own musicians. Others brought snacks. Poets recited verses. Philosophers argued under domed ceilings, echoing with laughter and steam. In essence, a Roman bath was a democratic space, at least by Roman standards. Status mattered, but even emperors might share a room with commoners. Slaves and women had restricted access or separate hours, but they too were part of this daily world. For the Romans, bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about routine, health, society, and rhythm. A place where the individual dissolved, just a bit, into the larger hum of the empire. One breath of steam at a time. Roman baths weren't just impressive. They were engineering masterpieces. Long before the modern sauna or heated flooring, the Romans figured out how to transform bricks, fire, and water into an immersive wellness centre. At the core of this innovation was the hypocaust system, an early form of central heating. Beneath the floors of the hot rooms, slaves stoked a roaring furnace, or prefernium. This fire heated a space beneath the raised floor, supported by small columns called pillae. Hot air flowed through this subfloor chamber and up through flues in the walls, radiating heat through the room like a gentle oven. The result? A consistent, enveloping warmth without smoke suffocating the bathers. The architecture itself was strategic. Vaulted ceilings trapped heat, domes diffused sound, and a complex arrangement of rooms regulated temperature flow, from the cooler apoditerium to the temperate tepidarium to the blazing caldarium. Windows were designed to harness sunlight, and water was constantly circulating, clean, flowing, and heated to exacting standards. And let's talk about the aqueducts, the silent heroes of the empire. These elevated stone channels delivered vast quantities of water into the cities, allowing even inland bath complexes to operate year-round. Some of the grandest baths, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, consumed millions of litres of water daily. Yet the system was so well built that waste was minimal and flow was constant. The water wasn't just used for soaking. Romans also had steam rooms, saunas, and even primitive flushing toilets nearby. Sewage was carried away through underground drainage systems. Again, all gravity-powered. The baths weren't isolated marvels. They were integrated into the broader infrastructure of Roman urban life. Maintenance was constant. Workers known as fornicatores tended the furnaces, while others cleaned the pools, managed supplies of wood, or repaired tiles and plumbing. It was labour-intensive, but the reward was clear. These buildings didn't just last years, many stood strong for centuries. In an age with no electricity, no industrial machinery, and no digital thermostats, the Romans created a seamless experience of heat, comfort, and flow. That's why walking into a Roman bath wasn't just entering a building, it was entering a system, one powered by fire, sustained by water, and shaped by genius. Despite all the sweat, steam, and strigils, Roman baths were never just about physical cleansing. They were about information. In a society without smartphones, email, or newspapers, the baths functioned as a kind of open-air broadcast centre. Gossip didn't trickle here. It flowed. Senators, merchants, soldiers, and poets all mingled freely, with togas off and voices raised. Conversations carried across the tepidarium like wildfire. Who was sleeping with whom? What was the emperor plotting? Which general just lost a battle in the east? Who bribed which magistrate to get out of paying taxes? If you wanted to know what was happening in Rome, or what might happen soon, the bathhouse was the place to listen. This wasn't accidental. The Roman elite knew the baths were public arenas, and they used them strategically. Politics didn't stop at the Senate steps. They soaked right into the marble floors of the caldarium. A clever patrician might accidentally bump into a rival in the hot room and float a proposal under the haze of steam. Or perhaps a patron would meet a client to reaffirm loyalties, offer advice, or drop a veiled threat, all while lounging in the pool. Even emperors played the game. It's said that Hadrian and later Antoninus Pius made a point of visiting the public baths as an act of image control, appearing accessible, wise, and invested in the lives of ordinary citizens. Of course, they had private bath wings too, but showing up in the public zone was a statement. I'm still one of you, sort of. It wasn't just politics that steamed up the tiles. Businessmen negotiated deals, poets recited lines, philosophers debated ethics. The acoustics of the domed rooms often helped amplify voices, a useful trick for anyone who wanted their cleverness overheard. In a strange way, the bathhouse was Rome's version of Twitter, Wall Street, and the Senate floor, all at once. It was unfiltered, buzzing, and deeply performative, but it was also where strategy was born. Real decisions, military, financial, personal, often started here, far from the formal halls of power. Because when everyone is half naked, sweating and relaxed, masks fall away. And in the steam, the real empire whispered its plans. To the Romans, bathing wasn't just about feeling fresh or looking polished. It was a critical part of health and medicine. The bathhouse was where ancient wellness philosophy met practical self-care. Doctors recommended it, philosophers endorsed it, even the military encouraged it. Hot water, cold plunges, sweating and massages were all believed to purify the body and balance the humours. The four fluids the Romans thought governed health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these got out of balance, you got sick. But a visit to the baths, with its cycle of heating, scraping and cooling, could supposedly restore that balance. And there's some logic to it, even by modern standards. The heat of the caldarium opened pores, relaxed muscles, and helped with circulation. The cold plunge in the frigidarium reduced inflammation and invigorated the senses. The skin was scraped clean with strigils, which removed dirt, oil, and dead skin. Afterward, many Romans received massages using scented oils, sometimes infused with herbs, sometimes just olive oil. Today, We might call this detoxing or hydrotherapy. They just called it daily life. Some of the larger bath complexes even included small medical clinics where physicians, often Greek-educated, examined patients, offered treatments, or suggested dietary changes. If you had a cough, aching joints, or digestive troubles, your doctor might prescribe not a pill, but a visit to the tepidarium, or a change in your bathing routine. Exercise was part of the picture too. Many baths had attached palestra, open courtyards for physical activity. Romans boxed, wrestled, fenced, or played ball games before beginning the bathing process. The idea was to work up a sweat before entering the steam rooms. Health wasn't passive. It was earned, one push-up and plunge at a time. Even mental health wasn't ignored. The rhythm of the bath, its slow, deliberate transitions from room to room, encouraged reflection. Some Stoics and Epicureans even wrote about the baths as places to clear the mind and tame the emotions. In many ways, Roman baths were ahead of their time, an integrated space for exercise, cleansing, socializing, and healing. A kind of ancient wellness center, with better mosaics and slightly more gossip. For the Romans, a healthy body wasn't a goal. It was the foundation of virtue, clarity, and strength, and the bathhouse was where it all began. Walking into a grand Roman bathhouse wasn't just stepping into a building. It was stepping into an aesthetic experience. The architecture, the materials, the very air, everything was designed to impress, soothe, and elevate. From the moment you entered the apoditerium, changing room, you were surrounded by elegance. The walls were often painted in vivid frescoes, mythological scenes, pastoral landscapes, or even cheeky caricatures. Marble benches lined the room, niches held clothing, and on the better days, musicians played softly in the background while your sandals were taken by a servant. Then came the baths themselves. The tepidarium was usually the most beautiful room, designed as a kind of warm antechamber to the hotter and colder extremes. It was often circular or rectangular, with high vaulted ceilings, colourful mosaics on the floors, and large windows that diffused the afternoon light. The ceilings were sometimes coffered or domed, supported by columns of Egyptian granite or local stone. The caldarium, the hot room, featured heated pools and steam. You'd see bronze or terracotta braziers, and sometimes gilded taps that flowed with heated water. The floors were warm beneath your feet, thanks to the hypocaust system, and the air shimmered with heat. Decorative fountains and statues added a touch of divine elegance. Apollo, Venus, and Hercules all made appearances. The frigidarium, cool and serene, was usually the largest and most striking space. Its cold pool reflected a ceiling, often covered in painted stars or geometric patterns. The water itself glistened, sometimes lit by small skylights or open oculi that allowed a beam of sunlight to cut through the mist. There was a quiet stillness here, a contrast to the chatter and bustle of the earlier rooms. Everything in the Roman bath was designed to inspire awe. The use of imported marble, colourful tile work, and advanced geometry wasn't just vanity, it was a statement. The baths were the empire distilled into stone, orderly, refined, and proudly extravagant. Even smaller local baths took design seriously. Mosaics often warned bathers with humorous Latin phrases like "Cave Canem, beware of the dog," or "Balneum Gratum, the bath is pleasant." These were spaces meant to charm the eye, calm the spirit, and remind you, in case you forgot, that you were living in the greatest civilization on Earth. And all of that before you even got wet. While Roman baths were public spaces in theory, not all Romans experienced them equally. The bathhouse was a microcosm of Roman society, a place where lines blurred, but never fully disappeared. Let's start with class. In the grand thermae of Rome, like those of Caracalla or Trajan, emperors might bathe in the same rooms as commoners. That sounds democratic, but social distinctions still lingered. The wealthy often arrived with entourages, slaves to carry towels, oils, and even portable benches. They could afford private massages or extra services in nearby rooms. Some larger baths had exclusive sections, scolae, reserved for upper-class patrons. Even in the shared pools, there was an unspoken hierarchy. You might rub elbows with a senator, but you weren't about to chat him up. Then there was gender. Men and women did not usually bathe together. Most large bathhouses offered separate hours or separate wings. Some emperors, like Hadrian, enforced strict segregation. Others, like Commodus or Elagabalus, allowed, or even encouraged, mixed bathing, much to the horror of conservative Roman moralists. Women's access depended on time, location, and the whims of local officials. In wealthier cities, women had beautifully appointed baths of their own. In poorer regions, they often bathed early in the day, before men arrived. While some women enjoyed regular access, others, particularly those of lower status, had to navigate schedules, scrutiny, and social stigma. Slaves and freedmen made up a significant portion of bath visitors. They were allowed in and often encouraged to attend, especially if their work was labour-intensive. However, they typically entered during off-hours or in more modest facilities. That said, many slaves worked within the bathhouses as attendants, masseurs, or fire-stokers, and some were known by name for their skill and charm. And what about outsiders? Foreigners, non-citizens, and provincials were welcomed in most Roman cities, especially in the empire's heyday. In fact, the spread of Roman baths across conquered territories was one of the empire's tools of cultural integration, a way of saying, "Welcome to Rome, now take your clothes off." So yes, the Roman baths were a shared space, but just like in the forums or the Senate, your experience depended heavily on who you were. Still, for a brief moment in the mist, the hot stone and the splash of cold water, those lines could blur, and that was part of the magic. Though bathing was the central activity, Roman bathhouses were far more than places to get clean. They were entertainment hubs, part gym, part theatre, part lounge, where you could easily spend an entire afternoon, and many did. In fact, larger bath complexes resembled ancient leisure centres. After a workout in the palaestra, a courtyard used for wrestling, boxing or ball games, you might take a stroll to the library, located just off the main hallway. Yes, many baths had libraries. Romans could relax with scrolls by Cicero or Virgil, blending physical rejuvenation with intellectual stimulation. A healthy body and a healthy mind. Both were on the menu. Music filled the air too. It wasn't uncommon to hear live performances from flutists, harpists or singers echoing through the domed chambers. Bathers might be serenaded while reclining near a fountain or getting an oil rub down. In fact, some bathhouses employed professional entertainers to keep the mood light and luxurious, from acrobats to comedians. There were also food stalls and snack counters, often located in or near the apoditerium. Known as popinae, these small eateries served wine, bread, olives, cheese and dried fruits. For wealthier patrons, personal slaves could bring more elaborate dishes, and the occasional exotic treat, from nearby villas. So yes, you could technically eat grapes in the steam room like a decadent emperor, though etiquette varied. Gambling was common too. Dice games, betting on athletic matches, or just casual wagers among friends added an air of mischief to the setting. These activities weren't always legal, but they were tolerated in bath culture. After all, people came here to let loose. The bathhouses also had spaces for intimate encounters. Some rooms functioned as private lounges or even brothels, depending on the time and location. Morally ambiguous? Definitely. But Roman society had a much different view of public space, privacy, and sensuality than we do today. And the steamy, dimly lit atmosphere of the Caldarium only added to the allure. One of Rome's most remarkable achievements wasn't just building an empire, it was standardizing the Roman experience across thousands of miles. And that included baths. From the misty highlands of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, And from the forests of Gaul to the sands of Syria, the Roman bath became a unifying symbol of Roman identity. Wherever the legions marched and the engineers followed, they built roads, forts, and bathhouses. These provincial baths weren't just carbon copies. They reflected local resources and customs while still following the essential Roman layout: apoditerium, tepidarium, caldarium, frigidarium. In cold climates like Britain or Germania, the hot rooms were especially important. In warmer places like North Africa or the Levant, some bathhouses expanded the shaded colonnades and cooled pools, offering relief from the blistering sun. Cities like Timgad in Algeria, Jerash in Jordan, and Bath in England all featured impressive thermae, often with mosaics, sculptures, and inscriptions celebrating imperial generosity. These weren't just public works, they were propaganda in stone. Every polished marble slab and steaming pool reminded locals, this is Rome, and Rome takes care of its people. But baths also played a critical role in cultural integration. For newly conquered peoples, the bathhouse served as a soft introduction to Roman customs. You might still speak your own language at home, but once you stripped off your clothes and stepped into the steam, you were participating in a Roman ritual, one that transcended ethnicity, origin, or local tribe. It also became a mark of urbanization. A city wasn't truly Roman until it had proper baths. They often came bundled with forums, amphitheatres and temples, creating civic centres that mirrored those of the capital. Bathing, then, wasn't just about hygiene, it was about civilization. Of course, local twists remained. In Syria, baths sometimes incorporated Eastern architectural styles and mixed-gender spaces. In Britain, Celtic traditions subtly influenced the bathing sequence, and in Egypt, older Hellenistic models blended with Roman designs to create hybrid complexes with lush courtyards and incense-filled chambers. No matter the local flavour, the Roman bath became a universal experience, one that made an empire feel cohesive. A place where even at the farthest frontier, you could close your eyes in the caldarium and, for a moment, feel like you were in the heart of Rome. Like so much of Roman civilization, the glory of the baths didn't last forever. As the empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, so too did the great bathhouses. What had once been daily rituals for millions slowly slipped into disrepair, abandonment, and, eventually, ruin. Several factors contributed to this decline. First, the empire's economy crumbled under the weight of inflation, military overreach, and political instability. Funding the maintenance of vast bath complexes, which required teams of workers, constant fuel for the hypocaust, and clean water from aqueducts, became unsustainable. Then came the breakdown of infrastructure. Aqueducts fell into neglect or were deliberately destroyed during invasions. Without running water, the baths lost their core purpose. The once bubbling caldariums went dry, and the marble halls echoed with silence. Religion also played a part. As Christianity became dominant, public bathing, especially mixed or nude bathing, came under increasing moral scrutiny. Church leaders saw the baths as symbols of pagan indulgence and bodily vanity. While some Christian emperors tried to preserve the public health function of the baths, others shut them down or repurposed them into churches, monasteries, or administrative buildings. And yet, the legacy of Roman baths endured. In the Islamic world, the tradition continued through hammams, bathhouses that carried forward many Roman innovations: heated rooms, steam treatments, and communal cleansing rituals. These spread across the Middle East and North Africa, preserving the essence of Roman wellness in a new religious and cultural framework. In Europe, spas and mineral baths became popular during the Renaissance and later Enlightenment, especially in places like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. These revived bathing as a therapeutic and social activity, echoing the Roman model even as the empire itself was long gone. Today, the ruins of Roman baths still captivate visitors. The baths of Caracalla, the Stabian baths in Pompeii, and countless smaller sites across Europe and the Mediterranean remind us that Rome didn't just conquer through the sword, it conquered through comfort, engineering, and shared ritual. Roman baths may have crumbled, but their spirit lives on. In our gyms, our spas, our hot showers, and our quiet moments of self-care. In a way, every time we draw a hot bath or sit in a sauna, we're channeling a bit of the empire, steam rising, tension fading, time slowing, just as it did 2,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt, medicine didn't live in a laboratory. It lived in the temple, the home, and the world of the gods. Healing was not just a science, it was a spiritual art, and the person who treated your illness might just recite a spell while applying a poultice to your wound. That's because Egyptian medicine was deeply intertwined with religion. Illness, to them, wasn't only about injury or infection. It could also be caused by the wrath of a god, the invasion of a malevolent spirit, or a disruption in Mayat, the cosmic order that governed all things. So, doctors, known as SWNVU, weren't always working alone. They often collaborated with priests who specialized in ritual and incantation. Together, they formed a dual force of treatment, one applying remedies, the other invoking divine protection. Temples were more than places of worship, they were centers of healing. Specific temples, like those dedicated to Imhotep, the architect, physician, and later deified healer, served as proto-hospitals. People would sleep there in hopes of divine dreams that revealed the source of their ailment or the cure itself. This was called incubation, and it was a respected method of diagnosis. Medical training was rigorous. Physicians studied scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus, which outlined hundreds of remedies, procedures, and case studies. These documents show that while the Egyptians invoked gods, they also observed symptoms, recorded outcomes, and developed surprisingly advanced techniques, from wound suturing to dental care. But make no mistake, incantations were not just decorative. Many prescriptions included spells as ingredients. A broken bone might be treated with honey and linen, plus a recitation to ward off evil spirits. Psychological conditions, now recognized as mental illness, were seen as spiritual afflictions, often requiring the intervention of a priest or magician. To us, this fusion of medicine and mysticism might seem contradictory, but to the Egyptians, it was holistic. Body, mind, and spirit were part of the same continuum. Healing one meant addressing all. In the land of the Nile, to be a healer was to walk between two worlds, with one hand mixing herbs and the other raised toward the gods. Long before stethoscopes and lab tests, ancient Egyptian physicians relied on their senses and experience. They became masters of visual diagnosis, feeling pulses, examining wounds, and interpreting subtle signs in the body to understand what was wrong, even if they believed the root cause might be spiritual. The first step in diagnosis was always observation. Physicians would examine a patient's posture, skin color, breath, and even urine or feces to search for visible or olfactory clues. Was the swelling soft or hard? Did the discharge smell sweet or foul? These observations weren't just guesswork, they were documented, compared, and passed down through generations. The pulse held particular significance. The Egyptians called it the speech of the heart. They believed that the heart was the center of a system of channels, similar to a network of irrigation canals, through which air, blood, and spirit flowed. If the pulse was irregular or weak, it suggested that one of these vital channels was blocked or disturbed. Although their anatomical understanding wasn't perfect, their conclusions often reflected real symptoms and led to logical treatments. Yet when no physical explanation was found, the physician would turn to spiritual causes. Was the illness a punishment from a god? A curse from an enemy? A lingering spirit refusing to leave the body? In such cases, diagnosis involved more than examination. It required consultation with a priest-magician, dream interpretation, or even astrological analysis. The alignment of stars and the behaviour of sacred animals might factor into the final verdict. In texts like the Ebers Papyrus, physicians categorised diseases based on patterns. They didn't always know why something happened, but they knew what usually followed. For instance, they could identify the stages of an infected wound or the course of a fever. These practical patterns formed the basis for treatment protocols, and interestingly, they were not always superstitious. Some medical texts explicitly separate physical ailments from spiritual ones. If a wound could be seen, smelled and treated, no spell required. But if all else failed, it was time to invoke divine aid. To an ancient Egyptian, the world was filled with unseen forces. But through keen eyes, careful hands, and centuries of accumulated wisdom, their physicians sought to make the invisible visible. When it came to treatment, ancient Egyptian physicians had an astonishing arsenal of remedies and recipes. Their pharmacies weren't stocked with pills and injections, but with herbs, minerals, animal products and oils, many of which they combined with surgical procedures and ritual chants. The result? A holistic approach that blended natural science with spiritual symbolism. At the heart of their medicine was the Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page scroll from around 1550 BCE. It contains over 700 prescriptions, addressing everything from stomach pain and toothaches to skin diseases and fertility issues. Each recipe was tailored, not just to the disease, but to the patient's body and social status, and often included precise instructions for mixing, timing, and application. One of their favourite ingredients? Honey. Prized for its antimicrobial properties and still used today in wound care. Honey was applied to cuts, burns, and ulcers, often mixed with other substances like crushed seeds or resin. They also used garlic, onion, juniper berries, and myrrh, not just for their aroma but for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory effects. Their pharmacopoeia included more exotic fare as well: crocodile dung for contraceptives, lizard blood for skin treatments, hippopotamus fat, and even mummified human flesh for particularly superstitious cures. To modern eyes, this may seem grotesque, but these remedies reflected their belief that the power of the ingredient lay not only in its physical properties, but also in its spiritual essence. Minerals like natron, a naturally occurring salt, were used to dry wounds, cleanse infections, and preserve bodies. Copper, known for its antimicrobial qualities, was sometimes crushed and mixed into salves. Oils from lotus, castor beans, and black cumin were used for massage and pain relief. Doses varied depending on the affliction. A prescription might read, mix crushed sycamore fruit, honey, and natron. Apply for 4 days. Recite the following spell over the mixture. In Egypt, words were medicine too. The spoken charm activated the cure. A reminder that for them, healing was as much about meaning as it was about chemistry. Far from primitive guesswork, Egyptian medicine was highly systematic, documented, and refined. While some remedies were bizarre, many were surprisingly effective, and some survive, in spirit or science, even today. Their medicine chest was drawn from the land, the body, and the gods, and they reached into all three to heal. While much of ancient Egyptian medicine focused on herbs and incantations, the Egyptians were not afraid to cut when necessary. They understood that some ailments needed more than a poultice or a prayer. They needed a steady hand and a sharp blade. The best evidence of Egyptian surgery comes from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old medical text, unlike any other from the ancient world. It is methodical, clinical, and strikingly modern in tone. It describes 48 cases, mostly traumatic injuries, skull fractures, broken collarbones, spinal wounds, and includes step-by-step instructions on examination, treatment, and prognosis. What's fascinating is how pragmatic the document is. It even classifies cases into 3 outcomes: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. In other words, treatable, uncertain, and hopeless. This was triage, a concept we still use in emergency medicine today. Egyptian surgeons used a range of tools: bronze knives, scalpels, forceps, cautery hooks, and needles. They practiced stitching wounds, draining abscesses, setting bones with wooden splints, and even performing circumcisions. Some mummies show evidence of successful bone healing, indicating that patients survived their injuries and continued living for years. They were also pioneers in wound hygiene. Before stitching a cut, a physician might cleanse it with honey, beer, or resin, all of which have antiseptic properties. They then applied bandages soaked in oils or herbal mixtures to reduce inflammation and promote healing. Pain was eased with opium extracts or sedative herbs, though there's no evidence of general anesthesia. Surgery was likely painful, but quick and precise. One striking detail: Egyptians often left foreign bodies, like embedded arrowheads, in place if removing them posed greater risk. It shows a nuanced understanding of anatomy and risk management. They knew when not to intervene. Of course, surgery had its limits. There's no record of internal operations or major amputations. They lacked knowledge of circulation and infection the way we know it today. But within the boundaries of what was possible, Egyptian surgeons were remarkably skilled. They didn't just experiment. They observed, recorded, and passed their knowledge down. Through bandage and blade, Egypt laid the groundwork for practical hands-on medicine. And centuries later, those lessons would echo through the halls of Greek, Roman, and modern surgical practice. In ancient Egypt, women's health was not a fringe concern. It was central to medical practice. Fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and contraception were all treated with serious attention, and women both received and sometimes practiced medical care themselves. One of the most fascinating sources on the topic is the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE. It's the oldest known medical text focused entirely on women's reproductive health. The document includes diagnoses and treatments for infertility, miscarriage, vaginal discharge, and birth complications. And like other Egyptian texts, each entry follows a familiar structure: the symptom, the examination, the diagnosis, and the treatment. Sometimes purely medical, sometimes magical, often both. For pregnancy, diagnosis began with clever experimentation. One common test involved having a woman urinate on barley and emmer wheat seeds. If the barley sprouted, she was said to be carrying a boy. If the emmer grew, a girl. If neither sprouted, she was not pregnant. Believe it or not, modern tests suggest this method may have had a modest accuracy, likely due to hormone levels affecting germination. Contraceptives were another area of focus. Ancient physicians used mixtures like honey, acacia leaves, and ground dates, inserted as a kind of barrier. Some recipes included crocodile dung, which sounds alarming, but was likely used for its sticky texture and symbolic potency. These were primitive forms of spermicides and barriers aimed at preventing conception. During childbirth, midwives took the lead. They used birth bricks, platforms on which the labouring woman squatted, and offered both physical and spiritual support. Incantations were spoken to ward off the demoness Amit, who was believed to cause miscarriages or birth complications. Protective amulets, especially those depicting Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, were worn to ensure a safe delivery. If labour was difficult, treatments ranged from massaging the womb with castor oil to having the mother breathe in herbal infusions or drink mixtures to stimulate the body's opening. Caesarean sections were unknown. If the birth could not be completed naturally, tragedy often followed. Still, much of Egyptian obstetrics was remarkably advanced for its time. It reflected a culture where fertility was divine, womanhood sacred, and life itself a process watched over by both healer and God. In the cradle of civilization, they respected the cradle of life, with every chant, every herb, every whispered hope. To modern minds, the blend of magic and medicine might seem contradictory, but in ancient Egypt, the two were inseparable. Healing the body meant treating the visible symptoms and the invisible forces, and sometimes the cure came as much from a spoken word as from a poultice. The Egyptians believed that illness could be caused by many things: natural imbalances, bad food, injury, but also curses, malevolent spirits, or the will of angry gods. If you broke your leg in an accident, that was one thing. But if your stomach hurt for days with no visible cause, that might be a demon, or even the restless soul of the dead, Ak, trying to torment you. In these cases, physicians turned to Heka, the sacred power of magic, which was thought to have been given to humanity by the gods themselves. Heka wasn't stage illusion, it was a legitimate divine force, just as real as water or fire. A healer might use it to activate a remedy, protect a wound from infection, or drive out an invisible entity. Spells were often included in medical texts, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the London Medical Papyrus. Some were poetic, others aggressive. One charm for treating burns reads, "O Isis, great magician, I call upon you to cool the fire in the flesh of your servant as you cooled the fire that scorched your own son, Horus." The spoken word was thought to imbue the remedy with divine power, turning herbs into miracles. Amulets were another form of protection and healing. People wore charms shaped like the Eye of Horus, Ankhs, or the scarab beetle, each with symbolic significance. These amulets were believed to ward off evil, prevent disease, and protect both the living and the dead. Some were even embedded in bandages or placed directly on wounds. Specific deities were also invoked depending on the ailment. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plagues, was feared but also prayed to for healing. Thoth, god of wisdom, was called upon to guide the hands of surgeons and scribes alike. In Egypt, medicine without magic was incomplete. The chant, the gesture, the symbol, all were part of the cure. Because for the ancient Egyptians, healing didn't just mean removing pain, it meant restoring harmony between the body, the soul, and the cosmos. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't the end of life. It was the beginning of eternity. And to reach the afterlife, the body had to be preserved with precision and care. Enter the art of mummification, a practice that blurred the lines between medicine, magic, and mortuary science. At its core, mummification was about preserving the physical vessel so the soul could return to it in the afterlife. The body was seen as essential, not just a shell, but a sacred structure that the Ka, vital spirit, and Ba, personality or soul, needed to navigate the underworld and reunite in the next world. The process began shortly after death. Embalmers, who acted as both technicians and ritual specialists, washed the body with palm wine and Nile water. Then came the most critical step, removal of the internal organs, which were quick to decay. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were extracted through an incision in the left side of the abdomen and placed in separate canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The brain, curiously, was considered unimportant and was removed through the nose using metal hooks. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was often left in place, though in later periods it too was removed and replaced with a sacred amulet. The empty body cavity was then stuffed with resins, myrrh, and linen, and the entire body was covered in natron, a natural salt mixture, to dry it out. After 40 days, the body was washed again, anointed with oils, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, layer upon layer, often with protective amulets placed between folds. Each step was accompanied by spells, hymns, and rituals, particularly from the Book of the Dead. These invocations protected the deceased from demons and prepared them for judgment in the afterlife. The embalmer often wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, to symbolize divine authority. In many ways, mummification was the Egyptians' most advanced medical procedure, a blend of anatomy, chemistry, and spiritual engineering. It wasn't about saving a life. It was about preserving it forever. To them, the perfect body was more than a sign of health. It was a passport to eternity. And in every carefully wrapped limb, they practiced medicine for the soul. While temples and tombs held the secrets of Egypt's gods, papyrus scrolls held the secrets of its doctors. Ancient Egyptian medicine was far from a series of oral traditions or tribal remedies. It was a well-documented, professionalized system, and much of what we know comes from the surviving medical texts, written with surprising structure and care. The most famous of these is the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, though it likely copied even older knowledge. Over 100 feet long, it contains more than 700 remedies for illnesses ranging from toothaches and stomach pains to mental disturbances and tumours. It includes detailed descriptions of symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, often paired with spells or incantations. Another key text is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a practical surgical manual written with clinical precision. Unlike other papyri filled with magic and prayers, this one reads like the notes of a war doctor. It presents case studies of traumatic injuries, mostly fractures, dislocations, and head wounds, and outlines step by step how to examine, treat, and prognosticate. It's a rare glimpse into how Egyptians could separate spiritual belief from empirical observation. The Kahun Papyrus is another treasure, focused specifically on women's health, fertility, and gynecology. It provides insight into birth control methods, pregnancy diagnosis, and even surgical procedures related to the uterus. These texts weren't hidden away. They were studied by scribes and physicians, many of whom trained at houses of life, scholarly institutions located within temples. Here, medicine was taught alongside mathematics, astronomy, and religious lore. Medical apprentices would copy texts by hand, memorize spells, and observe more experienced doctors at work. The Egyptians believed in preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Each scroll was a distillation of experience, observation, and divine insight, often attributed to gods like Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing. Physicians didn't just treat bodies, they carried forward the knowledge of millennia. Interestingly, some Egyptian medical ideas made their way to Greece, especially through figures like Hippocrates and Galen, who studied Egyptian practices and praised their methods. Egypt's influence on classical medicine is undeniable. In an age where much of the world relied on superstition alone, Egypt gave us one of the first examples of recorded, repeatable, and structured medical science, written in ink, bound in papyrus, and passed on with purpose. Though the sands of time buried their temples and tombs, the legacy of ancient Egyptian medicine never truly disappeared. In fact, many of their practices, beliefs, and innovations quietly shaped the course of global medical history. Their echoes still felt in today's hospitals, pharmacies, and spiritual healing traditions. First, their systematic approach to medicine was revolutionary. The Egyptians categorized symptoms, recorded treatments, and made careful observations about cause and effect. They developed early ideas about diagnosis, prognosis, and hygiene, centuries before the Greeks formalized such practices. Their emphasis on cleanliness, daily washing, antiseptic salves like honey and natron, even the importance of bowel regularity, prefigured modern public health long before the word existed. Their understanding of the mind-body connection was also ahead of its time. Though they didn't possess neuroscience, they recognized that psychological states could affect physical health. What they called spiritual affliction might today be recognized as depression, anxiety, or psychosomatic illness, and their combined treatments of herbs, rituals, and social support were surprisingly holistic. Even their use of herbal remedies has endured. Substances like garlic, castor oil, aloe vera, and willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, are still used today. Some refined into modern drugs, others sold in health food stores as supplements. And while crocodile dung didn't make the cut, their experimentation with contraception laid early groundwork for reproductive medicine. But perhaps most enduring is their idea of the healer as both technician and guide. In Egypt, a physician wasn't just someone who closed wounds. They were someone who understood suffering. Healing was physical, emotional, and spiritual. That human-centered model has re-emerged in modern holistic medicine, palliative care, and even psychotherapy. The fusion of medicine and magic might seem strange to us, but it points to a truth that still holds. People don't just want to be cured, they want to be seen, comforted, and understood. Ancient Egyptian doctors knew this, and their scrolls, amulets, and incantations were not just treatments, they were acts of care. Their medicine wasn't perfect, but it was daring, structured, curious, and deeply human.